I can keep meeting people while you're introducing Keisha.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So welcome to the fourth week of the course and the final week of developing your theory of change. So next week we'll move on to something different. So in today's session, we're going to do a recap of what we've learnt in this module over the last 3 weeks, as well as drilling into any final questions that you might have about developing a theory of change or any of the course content this week on assumptions or principles or interrogating your logic. So just a bit of housekeeping as normal, just make sure you keep yourself on mute except when you're speaking, and use the chat box or the raise hand function if you'd like to communicate something to the broader group or to Leanne or myself if there's something that you'd like us to have attention to. As I've mentioned, we're recording the session today for those who can't make it and only recording the plenary session, so not the breakout groups. So our agenda for today is that Leanne is going to provide that recap of this week's content, but we're really keen to hear any final questions that you might have on developing a theory of change, as well as any challenges that you may have experienced while developing one, either in your project groups or having it go on your own as well. We will be going into breakout groups once, and we'll once again be using Google Slides. So I will hand over to Leanne now to run through this week's content. Thank you.
Thanks, Keisha. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see your faces again, some familiar faces. So last week we introduced the hierarchy that we use for theory of change and the process steps. So understanding not just what the levels mean and look like, but in particular, what do we actually mean by those levels, and how do we go through the process of designing a theory of change? Again, there's no right or wrong way, but there's an order to the process steps that make it sense usually. I think one of the main things that come up for people is, do we do our activities first and then work up to clarify the outcomes we're trying to achieve? Or do we start at the top with our broader goals and work our way down? And obviously, working your way down is far more strategic, but it's also far more difficult, as you would have been aware when we went through that process last week. And there were some really good comments and questions in last week's session around that process of working from the top to the bottom or from the bottom to the top. But we had a good go at clarifying a theory of change for the Castlemaine example. It got quite messy, which it always does, and that's part of the process. And it's almost like you've, I don't know how well you're aware of this expression, but a common expression that we have in Australia is, if I had more time, I would write a shorter letter, which means often we start really big and have a lot of stuff, and then we work down to what's really, really important and throw a lot out. And so I guess, doing a theory of change model is very similar. The process is very similar to that. Once you've got more time, you can, if you take more time, you can distill it down to something much more simpler. I was helping a client over the Christmas holidays with a theory of change for a very complex program, and I had a big thing on my lounge room wall at home over the Christmas holidays with hundreds of post-it notes all over the place. And we had the workshop yesterday, and I think we've got it down to sort of just 20 outcome statements, which is really nice to see it come from this big messy thing to a concise model, but it certainly took time for that to happen. Are there any elements of the recap from last week that other elements, Keisha, that you think I should cover off on?
I don't think so. I think that is kind of captured. I think maybe, are you able to explain a little bit more about the necessity of developing an outcome statement and why that is so important to get it right, I guess?
The necessity for developing an outcome statement.
In terms of the wording of it.
Pardon?
In terms of the wording of it.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, so I guess that is a really important part of what's makes a good theory of change model, is that we're describing not just a lot of activities, but the outcomes. And we have some rules of thumb in Clear Horizon when we're working with clients around what a good outcome statement looks like. And the first one of those is that it looks like the end state, or where you expect, how you expect things to look when they've been achieved. So an example might be that students are confident in something, or teachers are doing something differently. Government policymakers or government decision makers are considering certain things, or whatever that might look like, but it's about an end state, a state of achievement or a state of success, rather than describing the doing of something. And we often think about this from a people-centered approach, or we suggest that it should be thought about from a people-centered approach. For example, what do you expect landholders or farmers to be doing differently as a result of the work that you're doing with them? And usually looks like some change in their behaviours or attitudes, the way they think about something, the way they perceive certain things, and that ultimately the practices that they are having on farm or in government office if they're a decision maker around certain policy issues. So yeah, absolutely, the definition of an outcome and the crafting of a good outcome statement takes time, but it's super important.
Thanks, Leanne. Would you like me to share the slides now?
Yeah, thanks, Keisha. Thank you. So we're just going to run through a little bit more about theory of change, continue where we finished off last week, and then we're going to jump into a breakout session for a decent amount of time for you guys to have a chat about what you're grappling with, what you're learning, and what your questions are around what we have been learning so far in relation to theory of change. So recapping on those steps, we talked about all of those steps last week, but we only really started working with the first few steps. We're just going to talk about the latter steps now. We talked about the importance of understanding the needs and the context. Why does this project or program need to be, and who's it for? What do they really need? Then the first, that's the grey part, the pre-work. You need to be aware of that before you even start to clarify your theory of change. The first step being at that very high level of your logic, being really clear about the end of project or program outcomes and the broader goals. So the bigger picture reason for your program really, or your project, are the broader goals. And the end of program or project outcomes are your project's contribution to those broader goals. Steps 2 and 3 can be interchangeable, and we did talk about this. This came up last week. Do we start with the activities and describe how those activities get us to those end of program outcomes, or do we work down from the end of program outcomes? If you already know your project, you already understand what its activities are, and you're clarifying the theory of change after the program has been designed, then it does make sense to start with those activities and describe the pathways of change in between. Because you don't need to sort of pretend that you don't know what your activities are, of course. But if you're not really clear about what your activities might be yet, that means you're not clear what you might actually do on the ground to achieve change, then it does help to think about those intermediate outcomes first, and then work backwards from there to think about what activities would be most appropriate. The only problem with starting with the activities is that we're making an assumption that they are the right activities to achieve the change. So a bit of top down and a bit of bottom up is really useful. So we got through those steps. But the steps we didn't talk about last week were steps 4 and 5, 4 being consider your principles. So you often find when you're designing a theory of change model that some things that seem really important to your program, they're in your mind, they come up in discussion, you're not sure where to put them. And sometimes they turn out to be principles. And the reason why you can't work out where to put them, as in, are they an activity or are they an outcome, or are they an end of program outcome or broader goal, is because they're important to your whole program, and they are about the way you go about your program. So we call those principles, and we're going to talk about those in more detail in a moment. But just a tip for you from how I develop theory of change models is I start with my blank sheet of paper for the model, but I also have another sheet of paper called principles, because they often come up in discussion. I can put them there and remind myself to come back to them later. I also put another sheet of paper up for assumptions, because these also come up when you're developing a theory of change model. So step 5 is about interrogating the logic. Interrogate's a strong word, but by that we mean really engage with and do a critical review of your logic and surface the key assumptions at the same time. You'll notice that the key assumptions would have come up in discussion. It's not like we leave them to the end, really. Our brains are thinking about them all the time as we go through the process of surfacing the model, stepping out the theory of change, because inevitably the links that we're making between these outcomes and these outcomes are underpinned by assumptions. So let's talk about those two in a little bit more detail. Let's talk about principles first. Some people think of them as values, similar to you might see values in an organisation, or an organisation's business plan might describe their values. But they're really around the way we do things. I'll talk a bit more about those in the next slide. Why are they important to think about when we develop a theory of change? It's because they're about this philosophy of the program and ways of working, usually especially around the interaction with other actors. And they don't belong in the model. If you try and put them in the model, it will become overly sort of complicated or unnecessarily complex. But at the same time, they are sometimes so important that we want to document them and have them alongside the model. And another reason for doing that is that sometimes they're so important that we actually put our monitoring and evaluation effort towards looking at our principles and how well we are adhering to those when we implement our program. So it's not always the case, but sometimes one or two of the principles might be that important that we actually bring them into the evaluation process. So having them beside your model is a really good thing to do. It helps people remember that not everything has to live in the model, but the program is bigger than just what's in the theory of change model. So some of these examples you would be very familiar with in your work, considering social inclusion and gender equity, considering sustainability, working in a manner to leave capacity and structures when the funding ends, so making sure that the capacity and structures to continue to do the work is there once the funding has finished. Taking a strengths-based approach is another example, working in partnership. There's millions of examples, and these are just examples. The thing is that they're very particular and specific to your program. You can't just take the principles from one program and plonk them into your program. They will be quite unique to your project or program. Having said that, there are some that come up time and again, particularly around things like gender equity, social inclusion, working in partnership, and those sorts of things. Next page. And the final step is this critical review or interrogation of your model and surfacing the key assumptions. So this part is pretty important. And so when we build our theory of change, we're building it imagining that things are going to work out, right? We don't build a theory of how things aren't going to change. We build a theory of how we think things will change. So we're naturally taking a positive mindset to that process. But of course, we all know that things can go wrong. So when we do this interrogation, we sort of think about three things: a critical analysis, and we have a checklist for how you might critique your model. We identify what we call hindering factors, or things that could go wrong and not allow the project or program to be as successful as it might otherwise be, and identifying them early and putting things in place so that we can manage for that, and then articulating the key assumptions. So what big assumptions are we making about our program? So you can imagine a program where we have some great idea about something that we think will work really, really well, and we take that to the people who we want to, involve in the project, and they're like, actually, we don't want that. So this is a great example of an assumption we're making where that people want to change in a certain way. People want their capacity to be built. People want to know how to do certain things. People are actually wanting to change their behaviours or their practices. These are some of the assumptions we really do need to be aware of when we're articulating our theory of change, because these assumptions are the kinds of things that can make our program go off track or not be as successful as it might otherwise be. So I'm just going to talk in a bit more detail about each of those 3 points, and then we'll move into an exercise where you get to share your thoughts with each other and raise any questions you might have. Okay, so before we go into that though, I want to talk about the importance of having a narrative that's attached to your theory of change. So you've got your nice little model in place. Some people really like models, they engage with models. Other people prefer to read in a text form a description of your model. They're not so interested in the actual model itself, they want to read about it. We call that a narrative. And I'd say that no theory of change model is complete without a narrative. So having the actual visual diagram and the narrative together is pretty important. When you write the narrative for your theory of change model, imagining that you're presenting it to somebody. So someone interested to know what your theory of change is, and you need to speak to it, right? A good way that we find, a way that we find is useful to speak to your model, because it's complex, right? Where do you start? Do you start at the bottom? Do you start at the top? How do you do it? We'd suggest that you start with describing the need for the program and its context, okay? Why is this program needed? What context is it operating in? And just a brief description of that, which provides the context for people to understand your program. Then describe the goals. I start at the top. These are the broader goals. And these are also at that level, yes, our broader goals, and also if your model has a couple of pathways of change or what we call streams of change, big chunks of work that's going to happen to allow your project or program to be successful, then describe those as well. So it might be that you've got some really big goals around improved agricultural practices, and you have a training component, but maybe you also have a component where you're subsidising infrastructure, small-scale farming infrastructure. So you might say there's this goal that we're trying to achieve, and our theory of change is going to tackle that in these ways. It has a capacity building element, it has a grants element, whatever that might be. And then you go down to the bottom and actually describe the foundational activities first. And say, this program is founded on these activities. And then describe each of the pathways and change, the pathways of change. So, for example, in the example I just gave, we said maybe there's a capacity building element and there's a grants or infrastructure subsidies element. You might say, okay, for the capacity building element, we're going to run these kinds of activities. And as a result of that, people will be more aware of these issues, and through that, they'll become more capable of addressing them themselves. And that's the capacity building element, that we see people behaving in a different way or practicing agriculture in a different way through the capacity building stream of work. And then we have an infrastructure grants or subsidies stream of work as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to provide those grants. We're going to make people aware of them. We're going to encourage them to apply. And as a result of that, we expect to see some uptake of that. And as a result of that, we expect to see the infrastructure that those grants are subsidising in place. And as a result of that, we expect to see agricultural practices changing in line with whatever those improvements were going to be brought about through those infrastructure. So mapping out each of those pathways separately so people can get a sense of how your program is expected to work. And then, of course, concluding with describing some of the principles that are underpinning your model. So a principle in that example might be that you're going to make sure that there's a peer-to-peer network that supports the capacity building approach, so that farmers get to talk to each other as part of this program, and learn from each other. So it might be, we're going to follow the principle of peer-to-peer learning, something like that. And also acknowledge the key assumptions that underpin your model. An example might be that people actually need infrastructure changes to improve their capacity to farm better, or maybe it's just capacity building by itself that's required. So really understanding the assumptions you're making about what's required in your particular program to create that change. Thanks, Kasia. So let's move into the critical analysis. I said we have a checklist that you can use to think about when you're trying to critique your theory of change. Very hard to critique your own work. When we run this training face-to-face, we get people to critique each other's work, and that's possibly something we'll do later in this training when we get you into your project groups. But the typical questions we would suggest you ask is it plausible? When I look at the model, is it plausible that if I do these things, and implement these activities, I will start to see these kinds of changes? And if I see those kinds of changes, will I see these other changes, these high-level outcomes? Is it plausible? Are there any miracle leaps? And by this we mean, are we not making some big assumptions around if we do certain things, we will see this kind of change? So for example, if we're saying run a webinar, and as a result of that, we expect all these people who've attended the webinar to be doing what we want them to do differently. There's a big, well, that's what we would call a miracle leap, that you need to really understand and step out how change is going to occur. So it might be that through the webinar, people have more awareness of the thing you're talking about, and they're possibly getting in touch with each other and learning from each other. But there's some kind of stepping out of, there's more awareness, more understanding of how to do these things differently. Of course, there's some assumptions around willingness and motivation as well. And that might lead to people changing their perceptions about what they should be doing, and that might lead to behaviour change down the track. So without expecting that a webinar might lead to large-scale behaviour change, that is what we would call a miracle leap. Is it simple enough yet complex as necessary? By that we mean you really want your model to be no more complex than it needs to be. We don't mean it needs to be simplistic though. So it does need to capture the complexity of your project, but as simply as possible, capture the complexity, if that makes sense. Are the outcomes worded as end states? That's something we talked about before, about being really important. It's an important way to distinguish an activity from an outcome. Are the linkages clear? Is it clear which activities are leading to which outcomes? And are there, this is just something that we've decided, less than 10 words per statement, okay? You don't want paragraphs in your theory of change model. You want some clear statements, some very, very short statements of outcomes that makes it easy to read your theory of change. And is the language clear? By that we mean, avoiding unnecessarily complex language, so that a broader range of people who might be exposed to your theory of change and for whom you would like to engage with your theory of change. So that might be beneficiaries and funders, delivery partners, a whole bunch of different types of people. Does it speak to them? Can they just look at it and understand it, and understand how we think change is going to occur through your program? So that's the checklist that we suggest that you apply either yourself or to the work of others when you're reviewing a theory of change or critiquing it. And the second part of this interrogation is understanding the hindering factors and the program assumptions. So we'll talk in a bit more detail about assumptions in a second, but here we're really talking about the hindering factors. They can fall into two distinct categories. So there's the factors within your control, and there's factors that are outside of your control. So factors that are within your control are around things like the quality, the speed with which you do things, the quality in which things are implemented, the way in which priorities might be set. And then there's factors outside your control. So bigger picture political shifts, it might be environmental conditions. So for example, a great one for agriculture, obviously, is where, you have expected expected weather patterns, and then for some reason those weather patterns aren't like you expected that year, and the way you plan for your program was to expect a certain level of water or something like a rainfall or something like that, and you didn't get it and things failed. So they're outside your control. You can certainly be aware of them and try to manage for that. But factors that are within your control are things more like the quality with which agricultural research is being done and things like that. So being very clear about what you can and can't manage, and most people will be aware of this through certain risk management practices and so forth. Assumptions, on the other hand, are different. You can't sort of do anything about assumptions. You can't, in the same way as you can with hindering factors, where you can really think about and put risk management plans in place. Assumptions are they're not a bad thing. They are a part of every theory of change model, because theories necessarily are built on assumptions, but they're often implied. So the kinds of assumptions like whether a group of landholders or farmers wants to have their capacity built about something, you don't necessarily state those out very explicitly, but it's pretty important to state them explicitly and not leave them implicit in your model, because how successful you are will depend on how robust your assumptions are. So we explained that it's very important for you to actually be clear about your assumptions, make them explicit, say what they are, and then you can pay attention to them. And so it might be you have some assumptions that you feel very comfortable with, you have a lot of evidence for them. Going back to the example I was using before, maybe you've worked with those landholder groups before or those farmers before, and you know that they are very, very keen and would love the opportunity to have their capacity built. So that's an example of a robust assumption. It's an assumption that is likely to be that you've got high confidence in, and for which you have some evidence that it's going to be true. And then other assumptions we don't have much evidence for, or we might consider to be we have weak confidence in. And sometimes those are the ones that we want to pay particular attention to when we're monitoring our programs. I'll say a little bit more about assumptions on the next slide. And again, they fall into these, there's actually about 5 categories of assumptions. We're going to stick with the 2 main ones here. Those being the ones that are internal to a program, for example, the causal assumptions, and ones that are actually more external and are related to program context and dependency. So just for like the hindering factors, some are sort of outside your control, some are inside your control. With assumptions, it's more around their internal in relation to their being causal, related to the theory, and others are external. So causal assumptions are, so just like I said, embedded in our theory model. We are assuming that A causes B, and if B will happen if A has already happened. So for example, that if we raise people's awareness or understanding of something, that they will actually respond to that understanding and awareness and actually start to change their behaviour. When we map out our model, we have arrows saying, if we achieve this, then we can expect to see that. If we implement that, we can expect to see that change. We usually describe those with arrows. So almost every arrow in your theory of change model has an assumption underpinning it. External assumptions or program context and dependencies are related to the context, and they're outside of our control. They have big implications for our program. An assumption might be, we're assuming that the government is not going to suddenly change its policy on the relative importance of agriculture in our economy. That's a big external assumption that we make, and we hope those things are relatively stable so that the work that we're doing can continue to operate in that fairly consistent policy context. That's an example there. If we got any more, I think that's the end of the critical review, the interrogation. Oh, we're going to give an example of what an assumptions table might look like. Yeah, okay. So this is a simple version of our assumptions table that we attach to our theory of change models when we develop them, and we use it to guide some choices as well around whether we might put some monitoring and evaluation effort into them. We list the assumptions down the side. We assume that if farmers are aware of this new seed variety, that they'll want to use it. And then ask ourselves, how likely is it that this assumption is wrong? Low, medium, high, I don't know. What impact would it have on the success of the project if the assumption was wrong? Again, low, medium, high, don't know. And then deciding whether you need to pay attention to it. So go back to that example I just used here. We assume that if farmers are aware of this fantastic new seed variety, then they're going to want to plant it. How likely is it that the assumption will be wrong? It's a good question. We can only know that if we know something really about the landholders and that the farmers in that particular region, and how open they are to new varieties. Are they, what's their motivations there? Are they ready for that kind of change? Or are they more a community that likes to do things the way they've always been done and not that interested in new seed varieties? In fact, they might be suspicious of them. So again, context matters, right? What impact will it have on the success of the project if the assumption is wrong? Again, it will depend on the context of the project. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's really context specific. But if your program is obviously about improved adoption of a seed variety, this new seed variety, in order to improve, productivity and therefore provide a bit more stability to livelihoods, then, and if that's the only thing you're doing in the program, then yes, it's going to have a big impact on the success of your project if the landholders or farmers aren't that keen on adoption. So is that something you need to track, keep an eye on? Probably in that instance, because it sounds a bit risky to me. But other times you might say, no, this mob over here, they're pretty happy with trying new things. They trust us. They like trying new things. So we're pretty sure that the assumption is not going to be wrong. And therefore, we don't think it's going to be a problem for the impact of our program. And therefore, we're not going to pay much attention to monitoring it. We know that it's a pretty robust assumption, that there is a willingness there to try new things. So that's another part of what we do when we clarify our theory of change models, is make sure we've really, really thought about the assumptions. It's at this point where people often start to consider some tweaking to their projects or programs, some redesigning, because through this process, they've identified some problems before they've even started. That's definitely my experience. So, gee, it feels like a lot of talking, Keisha. This is the last bit of talking, and then you get to do an activity, and we get to hear some of your questions and respond to those. The last bit is visualization, and there's different ways of visualizing your models, okay? I'm just going to show you some examples. Again, there's no right or wrong, what makes sense to you, but I'll share some examples with you here. This is an example that you may or may not have seen before. This is a real program theory model that was developed at Clear Horizon for a client, and it was around improving the children around the age of 8. It was around them thriving, so them having a better start in life and being in a better position by the age of 8 in a particular area where that wasn't the case. And the way they've described it is they've visualised it as a tree, and they've thought about the roots as being, the ways in which they work to create change. And then they've thought about the trunk of the tree as the things they expect to see in place as a result of that way of working. So those first level of outcomes, if you like. And then they've thought of the branches and the fruit on the tree as the high level outcomes that they expect to see from their program. So it was a program around children thriving, and I guess the tree is a way of, a nice way of illustrating that sense of thriving. Not many clients choose to make their models look like this, but they're nice and different. And then the next one is far more standard and has the foundational activities at the bottom and the influencing activities next, right up through intermediate outcomes to end of program outcomes and broader goals. I actually think this is a very similar example to the one we just saw, but it's in a different format. They have some principles down the side. So their principles are not separate, but they're just down the side of their model. This is a pretty classical example. You'll notice the labels have different goals, benefits, and the program outcomes. Clients choose all sorts of different labels to use in their models, and it's a natural preferences from their organisation, and that's fine. That's how it should be. As long as I don't have the activities at the top, we don't mind. Here's another example. Again, slightly different labels. This is for specific to a type of approach that's very common in Australia at the moment called place-based approaches, where instead of one agency working on a problem, a lot of agencies come together to solve a problem together. So it might be a problem around unemployment, and it's not just the Department of Employment that's working there. It's the Department of Health as well, because there's health problems that are associated with unemployment. There's educational problems associated with unemployment and all sorts of things. So they come together and try and solve a problem together. It's called place-based approaches. And the hierarchy that they use on the left-hand side, instead of what we would normally use around like broader goals and program outcomes and intermediate outcomes and activities, they think about them as enablers for change and systemic changes in the community, instances of impact in the community that they're working with, and then broader population level impact. But the thinking is still the same. We have some foundations that we work from. We do stuff on the ground, which starts to create the process of change. And as a result of that, we start to see bigger changes, which is what we want to see, and which is why we're doing this program. Again, they've got their principles down the side in green. This is another way, again, where it's bringing the concept of time into it. It doesn't mean that other models don't have a concept of time. They do. If you're into program outcomes, you might be thinking of depending on the type of program you've got, you might be thinking about 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, depending on the nature of your project. And you can describe that. But this is another way of thinking about it, where we're working from, say, the start of the program, year 0, right through to, say, 9 or 10 years, and we expect to see certain changes coming online at certain times. So obviously at the start and right throughout your program, there's going to be work being done at that lower level, the foundational work. And then there's the earlier work, the activities that are being implemented, and they're probably from years 1 to 3, but activities never stop, right? You don't just do an activity and walk away and hope your program is successful. You're usually working on your activities the whole way through. But then from, say, year 3, you might start to see some of those other changes starting to come about, until much later, hopefully you get these bigger level impacts. So that purple box at the top, positive population level impacts, you might expect that later. These years obviously are not set, they're very context specific. But they're the sort of time frames we'd expect for big social innovation type, social impact type programs. So just a few examples of different ways of presenting your theory of change model. There's no right or wrong way. There might be some preferences in your organisation, and you might have your own personal preferences. The main thing is, does it step out and distinguish the activities from the outcomes over different time frames, the shorter term, medium term, longer term outcomes. That's the most important. Thanks, Keisha.
Thank you. So we'll jump into the activity now. So what we'll do, very similar to last week, I'm going to split you up into groups of 3 or 4 people, and I'm going to drop the link into the chat. So we have 2 questions on each of the slides. So if you're from group 1, go to the group 1 slide, group 2 to the group 2 slide, and so on and so forth. And what you will do is, the 2 questions are, do you have any questions about developing a theory of change, either anything that Leanne went through today or anything that you might have gone through in the course content? And do you have any challenges, or have you had any challenges experiencing developing a theory of change? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break you out into the breakout groups. We'll spend about 5-10 minutes in these breakout groups so you can have a good conversation with the other people in your group. And then we'll come back together as a whole group and we'll have a look at some of the questions that people might have and any challenges that they might have as well. All righty, I will open the breakout groups now. See you soon. Welcome back, everyone. It looks like by the Google Slides, you all had a lot of questions and some challenges as well, creating theories of change, which challenges are always good. You know, it means that you're really thinking about this. If you're like, yeah, I'm fine after only doing this for 2 weeks, then that would be very commendable, but very surprising as well. We only have 3 minutes left and there are a heap of questions. So the ones that we don't answer today, we'll make sure that they're included in the weekly email that goes out as well. So I'm going to quickly share my screen now. And Leanne, if you wanted to pick a couple to talk to.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. So Kate has brought all the questions together in a summary. So I'm just going to go to slide 6, which has the summary. Is it also possible to consider risks, maybe under hindering factors? Absolutely. Risks, the hindering factors are very much risks for your program. The only caution I would make is that when you think about the risks of a program, they're usually broader than the hindering factors. So a hindering factor is something what could go wrong. That's a form of a risk. If you only think about those, you might risk some other risks, like whether you have the right people to do the project and things like that. So when you're looking at your theory of change model and you're thinking about risks, you're only thinking about mostly that sort of stuff. So yes, it is about considering risks, but if you want to do proper risk management planning, you need to think beyond your theory of change model and much broader. Just to confirm, if the broader goals will come directly from the program or project document, ideally they would. Ideally, you would hope that the program document describes why this program is important in the first place and the bigger goals that the program is going to contribute towards. But it's not always the case, but if you're looking for clues, hopefully you find it in there. That's certainly what we do. We go to program documents and look to see if we can find a clue as to what the broader goals might be. They're not always there, but they're pretty important to include because it helps you keep your eye on a bigger picture, the bigger picture why of your program. How many intermediate outcomes or impact in a theory of change? There is no set number. I'd say as many as necessary and no more than what's necessary. So you don't need to put lots in there, but you need to put enough that you've sufficiently described the stepping stones from your activities to your broader goals. Asking for simple examples to familiarize the development of theory of change. So you would like to see some simple examples. Okay, I'll see if we can attach some of those, but I think there's an example of one in the case study, Keisha, the Story Labs case study that's part of the training materials.
That's right.
Yeah. Is it possible to modify the intermediate outcomes and activities during the middle of project implementation? I would say it's necessary. Some people think if they develop their model, it's set and they must keep it set for the life of their project. Actually, it's just a model. It's not reality. It's your best understanding of how you think change is going to come about during the life of your project. And if your understanding of how change is going to occur through your project changes during project implementation because you learn more about how things work, then yes, you should update your model to reflect your new understanding. It's a really important thing. When can we say our theory of change is correct? I hate to say it, but you cannot really know it until the project's finished, because that's when you truly understand how your project worked. Okay, you're working with not working with reality, you're working with your best model of reality, how you think things are going to work out. So it's important to keep it up to date, but it's pretty hard to know when it's really correct. But you have a sense. Does it or does it not reflect how you think change is happening through your project. How to incorporate assumptions related to the external factors and the dynamic external changes in a theory of change. So you don't incorporate the external factors or the external assumptions in your theory of change. It's important to note them, but you don't put them in the model. Okay, so you might want to acknowledge some of those external assumptions. You might want to keep a log of those external changes as you implement your project, so that when it comes to evaluation, you can say, you know what, we were making an assumption that, you know, the political landscape would continue to look like this, or that the weather would look like this, and it didn't happen. We've got some data that shows that, and that's why our project hasn't been as successful as we thought it might otherwise be. So it's part of your explanation for why your project did or didn't succeed as well as it could have. So you might want to note them, you might want to track them, but they don't belong in your theory of change model.
Sorry, Leanne, I think I might just pause there if that's okay. No, that's all right. They were really good answers, and hopefully we'll be able to answer more of them offline in the email. But thank you everybody for joining today. So that kind of concludes and rounds off the end of developing a theory of change. So next week we move on to measurement, which I think the next question on that slide was about how do we use the assumptions. That'll come next week. So we'll spend a couple of weeks on that, and then that will be the end of the M in MEL. So look forward to being on that journey. But if you have any other questions, if there are other questions that pop into your head after this session, you know the discussion board is always available for you to be able to ask any questions too. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.